Hello, and welcome to this podcast where we bring contributors from diverse sectors to talk to us about intensifying support for victims of SGBV and their participation in transitional justice processes. Well, this podcast is brought to you by the UNDP in partnership with the Government of Ireland. My name is Fatou Ellika Muloshi, a journalist working at the Gambia Radio and Television Services as an assistant producer, and I am your host for this podcast. Our contributor for this edition is Jama Jack, a feminist communications professional with experience of working in human rights advocacy and community engagement for more than 20 years. Jama is interested in the intersection between communication and human rights and uses her communications expertise to influence progressive narratives in human rights advocacy. Gemma will be presenting on the many challenges victims and survivors face in speaking out and what needs to be done once they decide to do so. But first, let's listen to the ever so inspiring voice and sounds of Jama Jack.
Every day nga dégg fi benn story. This time last year was a similar story. The new code still now ñu ci town bi. Worried for them, no. Just yesterday, Bakari rape na fi Khadi. Earlier today, Lamin door na fi Ami. Nekum Lord, this is not good for the society. Monday. So many women have been violated physically, sexually, psychologically. Many have been violated, but silence when they reach out for help. Women should be protecting them, but not to harm them. Women should be caring for them, not to harass me. Bukador, jigen warta joyo. Bukador, jigen warta joyo. Buguma de gumba di gis ben jigen di joyo. Darling ko de da failu dis ba muy saku walo. Yow mi di góor fexeel nga gisee ko yaay jabarato. Fexeel jàppale ko jox ko cëram bi mu yelloo. Bul ko mere bul ko saaga bul ko dooro. Bukador, jigen warta joyo. Bukador, jigen warta joyo. Bukadore, buko saga, bukadore. Bukador, jigen warta joyo.
Speak up, speak out, share your story. These are the statements we often hear being said to victims and survivors of sexual violence. Over the past few years, calls for survivor-led and focused responses to sexual violence have led to a really heavy concentration on the need for them to tell their stories. It is believed that this is an essential part of their healing journey, while also contributing to demystifying the problem and facilitating access to justice. Now, survivor-centered storytelling is great, as it reminds us all that behind every case of sexual violence, there is more than just a number. There is indeed a whole human being with a life, a body, a name, a family, a series of dreams and endless aspirations. It is a reminder that victims and survivors are more than just a statistic, and so responses to sexual violence must cater to their diverse and complex needs. Encouraging survivors to tell their stories can be good. Speaking up can help. Speaking out can make a difference. But we must always stop and ask, at what cost? At whose expense? What gives? And who benefits from the stories of sexual violence? The Gambia remains a highly patriarchal society where rape culture continues to thrive, perpetrators of sexual violence are rarely punished, and victims and survivors hardly get the justice and healing they deserve. Victim blaming is the general response to cases of sexual violence. What was she wearing? Did she really say no? Why was she out at that time? Why didn't she fight? Boys will be boys. These questions have become a constant refrain, and their impact on the lives of victims and survivors is hardly examined. They're further amplified each time someone shares the story of their experience of sexual violence, and it is usually worse when the victim or survivor is female, which is generally the case in the Gambia and other parts of the world. In most cases, the victim or survivor is left to deal with the effects of this backlash and the incessant poking of holes in their stories. They are left empty and hopeless after bearing their vulnerability to the world in their bid to get justice and healing. In a society where public opinion often has an impact on the reactions and commitments of duty bearers, access to justice for victims and survivors can be challenging. Now, these attacks and the vilification of the very people who need support, trust, and guidance often deters many from speaking up about their experiences, and this includes the very necessary reporting of cases for effective law enforcement. For many, it is better to keep quiet and hold on to their stories forever than to share it with the world and be further victimized and blamed for the violence they faced and the violation of their rights. So the choice is usually a very heavy one. We often say that there is power in sharing our stories of survival. We say this to the many victims and survivors of sexual violence as a way of helping them regain control over their narrative. And yes, there is indeed power in being the voice behind your own story. But there is also great power in holding on to your story until you are ready to share it, until you feel safe to bare your soul and be vulnerable in the face of a vicious society like ours. We all have a responsibility to support victims and survivors who are ready and willing to share their stories. The first one is to respect their agency and their right to decide when, how, and where they speak up and speak out. We must ensure that we're constantly creating safe environments for this experience and that their stories are not used for commercial value or sensationalized for the wrong attention. We must provide a space that prioritizes their humanity, their safety, and their well-being first. We must ensure that the reporting of these stories in the media and other spaces does not cause further harm. The government has a huge responsibility, of course, to ensure protection and justice for all victims and survivors, and to dismantle the pervasive culture of victim blaming that is often strengthened by the reality of perpetrators walking free. They must ensure that people can fully trust the judicial system to deliver justice without fear, favor, or interference. Beyond the assurance and dispensation of justice, everyone should be committed to the physical and mental well-being of victims and survivors. Healing is a long journey. For some, it begins with speaking up and sharing their stories. And in our commitment to respond effectively to cases of sexual violence, we must take the many complex factors into consideration. Speaking up can be powerful. Speaking out can be useful. Sharing personal narratives of sexual violence can contribute to a change in systems and in our current reality. But we must always remember to prioritize those who matter the most in this process, victims and survivors. We must honor their stories, hold them in their pain, and ensure that we're working to provide better and safer spaces for their healing.
Very well communicated, Jama, and thanks for that beautiful contribution. Well, as communications personnel, but also as feminists and activists, we must be truthful to the cause and stand by survivors to the end. Speaking alone is healing, but what healing means to someone can only be determined by them. There are clearly a lot of factors that deter victims and survivors from speaking up, and it's mostly the backlash Jama mentioned. The vilification and trauma victims continue to face is one reason why they often stay silent. We emphasize on speaking out because it's the first step towards getting justice. But one must not be forced to do so in a society that is intolerant to hearing victims narrate their stories of abuse. This is what needs to change. Society itself must take a first step towards change and in making the environment conducive for all to live. Speak up when you feel the need to do so, but speak out when you are strong enough to fight the battle. Also remember that when you do speak up, there is still a network of strong women who will be right behind you till the day justice gets to be served. And they will continue to make the noise until the justice system is responsive enough to their plight and well-being. For those who are SGBV victims of the previous regime, there is in addition the TRRC, whose statement takers, psychosocial support officers, and victim support staff are equipped to support you in your narration. We hope that victims can also get justice someday. Reparation comes in various forms, and we hope that they get the kind that gives them closure. My name is Fatou Ellika Muloshi, a journalist working at the Gambia Radio and Television Services as assistant producer, but also someone with a strong interest in women's rights advocacy. It was a pleasure hosting this podcast, and we hope to expand this discussion at a broader level for an all-inclusive approach to strengthening the development of women, which in the long run contributes to the development of the nation at large. Be vigilant at your homes, workplaces, and communities, and do not forget that the fight against SGBV is a collective responsibility. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and many thanks for listening.